We've been talking about Galatians 4, 8, 9, 10, and 11 in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and so we'll try to wrap that up this morning. Just basically read it again. But then indeed, when you did not know God, you served those which by nature are not gods. But now after you have known God, or rather are known by God, how is it that you turn again to the weak and beggarly elements to which you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid for you, lest I have labored for you in vain. And we talked about specifically the last week or so, verse 10 there. You observe days and months and seasons and years, trying to decide exactly what Paul was talking about there and what application we can make from that. This is kind of the summary of where we settled on that. Again, Galatians 10, you're celebrating these days, seasons, months, and years, and I'm afraid for you. But you back up to Romans 14, and Romans 14 talks about if somebody wants to set aside a special day, that's just fine. And we talked about the seeming incongruity of that. But the point I think we made, and the point we came down on, is the letter to Galatians was addressed to the Galatian churches, whereas Romans obviously was addressed to Roman churches. But in Romans 14, it starts out there in verse 5 talking about one person. And so talking about the individual versus the church as a whole. And we talked about, well, individuals, I can do things. I can set aside a day that I want to fast, I want to pray, I want to remember the birth of Jesus, whatever the case may be. I can do that personally as long as I'm doing it to the Lord. And we said that there's limits to that, obviously. And the example we used, I can't set aside a day to Diana of Ephesus, one of the goddesses, and say, okay, I'm going to honor her by honoring the Lord. Well, that doesn't work, does it? But for the most part, if I'm setting aside some day for my own personal benefit, my own personal meditation, prayer, study, whatever the case may be, Paul says there's nothing wrong with that. However, if the church as a corporate whole decides to do that, it's stepped beyond its boundaries as to what could be done, forcing people to celebrate some particular day or season when we have no scriptural record that was ever done, no command that it was ever told that we should do that. And the problem with that comes to, let's say, we all of a sudden, as we use that, we put a nativity scene in here and make Christmas an official celebration of the church. And I'll pick on Mike over here. Mike doesn't agree with that, which I know he doesn't. But he doesn't agree with that, but we all do. And so what happens to Mike in the process of that celebration? We alienate him. We are asking him to do something he doesn't believe in because we as a church have decided corporately that that's something we ought to do. And so that's the danger in that idea. And we understand that there's, again, a lot of things that I can do as an individual in my own personal spiritual growth, but the church hasn't been given that authority to do. And so, again, we use Christmas because it's just around the corner, and I get questions a lot from people outside of the church. Well, what are you doing for Christmas? Well, and I explain my view of Christmas. We have presents and trees, and do things that everybody else does, but we don't have a church celebration of that at all. And we'll mention it. Sometimes there's a sermon about Christmas on Christmas or around Christmas, but we don't celebrate it as a church. And the looks I get are what? Why? What's wrong with you people? And again, it's not that we don't appreciate the birth of Jesus. It's not that it's a biblical topic. It's a biblical thing to understand, and we ought to study it, and we ought to be familiar with it. But just nowhere in the Scripture have we been given the authority to celebrate that as such, as a church at large. And so that's where we kind of came down on our discussion from the last couple of weeks. And again, any other things y'all like to talk about before we move on in regard to that? Nothing? All right. Good. I was afraid the firm might. Okay.
When people ask me about it, I don't, we do not celebrate it as a religious holiday.
Yeah.
We celebrate it as a traditional holiday.
Sure. Yeah.
Because religiously speaking, we cannot find any authority.
Sure.
Because the bill was a man-made holiday started by the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
I think it's called Christ Mass.
Mhm.
And it's so involved in Christmas.
Yeah, exactly. We don't celebrate it as a religious holiday. Just like we don't celebrate July the 4th as a religious holiday, or Valentine's Day as a religious holiday. We celebrate it for the holiday that it is and enjoy that. Pam?
I always find that Jesus is special to us every Sunday, not just Sunday.
Sure. Yeah, he's special to us every Sunday, not just one day of the year. And sadly, those religious celebrations as such, and I'm thinking Christmas and Easter particularly because they're the big ones. What happens when you set aside those 2 days to a lot of people? That's the only time that they come. They come on Easter, they'll come on Christmas, but the rest of their time is not spent in any kind of celebration. And as a result of that, they're missing out on the weekly gathering of the church. Marcia?
On the other hand, this is a building.
Mm-hmm.
We are the church.
Yes.
So if we wanted, I'm not saying we should,
Mm-hmm.
if we wanted to have some Christmas celebration, there's nothing wrong with that in this building.
Okay.
Because it's not the church. We are the church.
Yeah. And the only issue I would have with that is when we start mandating that and saying, okay, this is what we have to do, that it's part of our religious practice. Yeah, I wouldn't go that far because, yeah.
I mean, I know different states are different. But when we lived in Kentucky, we had all kinds of Christmas things
Mhm.
for the children. And there was Christmas trees.
Sure.
and certain things
Yeah.
like that, but it was not part of our worship service.
Right.
And I just don't understand exactly what's, I think a lot of people would frown on that.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's saying that the building is safe.
Well, and I agree with you on that. We're looking at this building. Our teenagers had a holiday luncheon. What was it, Tuesday? They came, exchanged presents and all of that. No problem with that whatsoever, unless we make that a religious thing, a part of our religious practice. And so that's why I think maybe we resist that more than we should, just because we don't want to be guilty of doing the wrong thing.
Well, we don't want the world to think.
Sure, exactly.
I understand that, but I think there's a line there that.
Yeah.
Why don't we do that as a tradition?
Yeah, sure. I get it. Mark, go ahead, Flo.
Another extreme example is that that's how it shows. One of our elders was voting against kids who dressing up for Halloween or Easter bunny. So there's such thing as Easter bunny. You know, that's a little bit of extreme, especially those things, and causing division in the church. Because we think maybe we should have anything out, we could have had that outside.
Yeah, or trunk or treat in the parking lot, yeah.
Say that for their own.
Yeah.
You know, that's the extreme that we have to be careful. We get hung up on instead of what's important.
Sure, absolutely. And I think those are the instances in which why Jesus set up his church to have elders, to deal with those issues and to contemplate those and to be the point people for how we deal with some of those things. So again, I think we all understand that and appreciate it. Dave, you have a comment?
No, I just wanted to draw attention to Colossians 2:16, that no one pass judgment on you, question food and drink, with regard to the festival or to the Sabbath. Seems to be
Yeah.
backing up what Flo was saying, that, as an individual, that there are lots of festivals we observe that may have their basis in paganism and food, such as Halloween and so forth. That, they may have had their beginnings in paganism, but, it's something we enjoy doing.
Yeah.
It's not religious, sure.
Yeah, and a good example of that is if we're going to eschew all references to paganism whatsoever, then we cannot say that we come to church on Wednesday night, because the word Wednesday comes from Woden's Day. So again, that's a little way out there issue, but something to keep in mind just because of its roots doesn't necessarily mean that's what it is now. Bob?
I feel if we keep not celebrating, not church sanctioned, but celebrating anything that somebody outside the church says is pagan, pretty soon we're not going to be doing anything because it becomes really easy for somebody to simply say, as they typically do, oh, you're fill in the blank. And, oh, no, I'm not. Therefore, we back away from it, and I feel it will more isolate us from the world around us. We're not supposed to be of the world, but we are in the world. And in the world is where we have our influence of being children of God.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. Any other thoughts? Go ahead.
It seems as though the scribes and the Pharisees and all, they had their special stuff. And Paul says there is in Timothy that it is an appearance of godliness. And so you put that stuff into operation and you forget about the other things.
Yeah.
The power of God.
Sure. Yeah. You tithe your dill, your cumin, your mint, and neglect the weightier matters of the law, mercy, justice, and all of that. All right? All right. Les, I'm not advancing again. Yes.
Just point out one other thing, because even in Corinthians, Paul is talking to the church of Corinth, and he's warning them essentially about spiritual idolatry. And then when we start to incorporate these different practices and these different traditions, then the risk is creating a stumbling block for our brothers.
Yeah.
And one of the things, you mentioned that earlier, if we start to do those things, then that's the major risk. We don't want to be a stumbling block for our brother.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And again, that's kind of what Paul talks about in Romans 14 about how to deal with that. It's your conscience sake. And we've got to be careful of the consciences of those who, again, he was talking about weaker brethren in that context. And so we have to remember that. Dave?
Yeah. I have labored over you. I'm afraid I've labored over you in vain. That implies lost souls.
Yeah.
So can we conclude that Paul was talking about an entire congregation or an entire group of congregations in Galatia that were baptized and brought into Christ and now they're lost because of this?
It sounds like that, doesn't it? I mean, Paul wouldn't say, "I'm afraid for you. I've labored in vain for you," unless it was a big deal, a serious thing. And again, we don't want the church to be the church here to have labored in vain, and for us to mess that up simply because we decide we're going to do something outside the realm of what's acceptable. Go ahead.
And my next point is that implies that there were churches that there may have been churches in the first century which were not part of the body, that were part of the body of Christ and then became separated from
Sure.
the body of Christ, which is makes a case for denominationalism today.
Sure.
If there were churches in the first century that Paul had labored over in vain, there certainly are churches today that Paul labored over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, Amy.
It's my short time on earth, but it's my observation that we'll never find a balance.
No.
Mankind, if you can look at different denominations, you can look at all our marriages, our friendships, our work-life balance, it's always never going to be perfect. On this side of earth, there'll always be a balance. We can try.
Yeah. That's all we can do. We can try, do our best, but as long as we live in a fallen, sinful world, it's not going to ever be perfect. That's why we're looking forward to heaven. That's why. That's why Christ died. So we're looking forward to heaven where it will be perfect. Mike?
I think the statement there, if he is referring to afraid to have labored in vain, I think that's a reflection back to kind of where he started the letter in chapter 1, verse 6. I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who calls you. So he's amazed that they're leaving so quick. He's afraid that what he has planted is not going to continue. I think that
Yeah.
It's kind of a reference back to that, which, again, as Dave pointed out,
Yeah.
would indicate that, you know, there's some that's lost their candlestick, has been removed.
Sure, yeah.
They removed themselves from the gospel.
And it isn't, you mentioned the candlesticks, isn't that what Revelation, the first couple of chapters of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3 talk about? Churches that are in trouble, with the exception of a couple of them, because they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing. And John writes Jesus' words to them to help them figure out how they need to be living and practicing as a church. Again, the Galatian problem, Jewish Christians were observing days, months, seasons, and years, returning to the practice of the Mosaic covenant's requirements, and they were also perhaps insisting that Gentile Christians also practice these requirements. It's also possible that the Gentile Christians were returning to their previous pagan practices. So any of those could be true, and I think it was John Rabb last week who made the point, it doesn't really matter which one of those it is. If you're going back to the pagan practice, you're going back to the Jewish practice, neither one of those was acceptable under the new covenant with Jesus. And then, this is where we kind of will start. Brethren, I urge you to become like me before I became like you. You've not injured me at all. You know that because of physical infirmity I preached the gospel to you at the first. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Jesus Christ. And so that phrase there, I urge you to become like me. What's Paul saying there? And again, keeping it in the context of what we've been talking about. Dave?
I wish you had read on some, because Paul says that he says, if it's possible, you would gouge out your eyes and give it to me. Or maybe refer to the elders, but I think that's what he's saying. Become like me, in other words. Pay whatever the price is.
Okay.
To honor Christ. Does that mean giving up the things we just got to talking about? Then give those up. But you be courageous, stand firm, and if necessary, be ready to gouge out your very eyes.
Okay. All right. So Dave's making the point, and I think it's a good one. We'll go ahead and throw this up. This, again, Denny Petrillo from Workshop in the Word that we mentioned a couple of times. This probably means that Paul became free from the law just as they are free from the law. And even though Paul was a Jew and they Gentiles, they both shared a common journey from slavery, from a works law system to faith in Christ. And Paul is saying, you're practicing the days, months, seasons, and years. I'm afraid for you. I gave those things up too. I'm like you. And yet you're going back to what you had. It seems to be, to me, what he's saying there. And how much harder was it for Paul, the devout Jew that he was, to give up those things than the Gentiles who had never done them to begin with? Because the Gentiles had never been given the law, never been expected to keep the law and practice the law, because it wasn't for them, it was for Israel. And so, I urge you to become like me, for I became like you. We're all together in this. That's, again, the point he's trying to make. And then he says, you haven't injured me at all. Doesn't it seem like that kind of comes out of the left field? He's been talking about days, months, season, year. I'm afraid for you. I urge you to become like me. You haven't hurt me at all. Where did that come from? And what's he saying? What's the implication by that statement?
ESV says you've done me no wrong.
You've done me no wrong, ESV says. So what does that mean?
You're not hurting me, you're hurting God.
Okay. All right, you're not hurting me, you're hurting God, you're hurting the church, you're hurting Jesus with your actions. You're not hurting me. It's bigger than that, all right? Anything else?
Well, if you read on, he talks about his infirmity.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, he didn't mistreat me.
Yeah.
Because of that.
Yeah.
Obviously, they weren't passing judgment on him because that's what the cause, whether that was
Sure.
his eyesight, you know. There's school about it with his eyesight.
Yeah.
Because of what he says about big letters and all that later on. But I think he was competent a little bit because of his weakness or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. So it's a transition statement, isn't it? He's going from what he's been talking about, I'm like you, you're like me, from the practicing and the law and all of that stuff, transitioning to where he's going to talk about more of his physical situation and how they accepted him. A point that I think we ought to keep in mind is, Paul's fussing on this church, isn't he? I mean, he's getting after him. He's not just saying, well, you guys ought to think about this. He is using his apostolic authority to say, this is not right. This is what you're doing. You need to fix that, and you need to do that. And the response of the church could have been, well, who gives you the right to say that? Who cares what you think? Or the church's response could have been to fix things and make things right in that context. And so, again, I don't know if any of that went on because Paul doesn't talk about it. But he's basically saying, okay, we've talked about all this bad stuff. And I've pretty well fussed about it because I don't think it's right. But none of that has injured me. None of that has hurt me. None of that has been directed at me. I have not been grievously injured because of this. And maybe he is in some way trying to soften the blow a little bit of what he's been saying. Just to know, I'm not, he said, I'm concerned about you. I marvel at all of that. But at the same time, you haven't hurt me, and this can be fixed in that context. Go ahead, Dave.
I'm just trying to figure in my mind what kind of body ailment would be causing them to have, that would be a trial for them and cause them to scorn or despise it.
Okay.
Kind of makes me wonder whether he had some body odor or something going on with that.
Well, let's talk about that.
There are lots of ailments that left untreated in our modern medicine could be discussed with people around.
Yeah, okay. I'm not advancing again, Les. All right. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at the first. And so this physical infirmity, scholars have been trying to figure out what was this physical infirmity. Flo pointed out kind of the leading theory about that was his eyesight. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. Yeah, his thorn in the flesh that he talks about, that he asked God to get rid of 3 times, and God told him what? No. And the reason why was what? The abundance of the revelation, lest this is Kevin's paraphrase, lest I get too big for my britches, because of that. That infirmity kept him humble. Marcia, you had a comment.
Well, it's like you way out of the field, but maybe it's the right light that blinded him.
Okay.
And maybe that was God's plan, because he was going to be a perfect human being. He's going to have, like everyone, some type of issue.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Absolutely. You know that because of physical infirmity, I preached the gospel to you at first. Paul's first visit to the area, Acts 14, verses 1 through 20, it seems to be that he's saying it was because of physical infirmity. Now, whether he went there to Galatia to recuperate from whatever that physical infirmity was, or he got to Galatia and had to stay there because of that physical infirmity, we don't know, because, again, we don't know what it was. We don't know, and that's what Denny's commentary points out. We don't know what caused it to be there, although that was an important part of Paul's life in dealing with the Galatian churches, whatever the issue was. Theories about that. Number 1, maybe it's a result of the injuries he suffered by being stoned. Acts 14:19, 2 Corinthians 11:25. We don't think about that. And honestly, as I was preparing this lesson, kind of got to thinking, I really don't think about that. Paul got beat up. He had a lot of stuff that he went through. Was there a physical toll that had been placed on Paul? And I think the answer is yes. It has to have been. You don't get treated that way. And again, modern medicine versus ancient medicine. what he would have been, what treatments he could have received then, that he weren't available to him, the stuff we have now. That could have been an issue for Paul as he continued on his preaching. Mike?
He was left for dead after the
Yeah.
and maybe he was dead, or maybe this was the time where he went to the, what do you call it? When he talks about seeing things, no man has the right to see it.
Yeah.
That he talks about, so.
Yeah, so Paul...
So it was a severe
Sure.
study, it wasn't minor.
Yeah, it was severe, and I think we forget that was a severe thing. You know, they left him, they thought he was dead. And so, you know, that's pretty traumatic to your body and to your mind to have something like that happen. And so Paul is talking about that, and again, we're not going to ever figure out what it was because there's just not enough information. So your opinion on that's as good as my opinion on that. So maybe it was the injuries he suffered from being stoned. Maybe it's injuries suffered from him being beaten. Acts 16:22, 2 Corinthians 11:25. I like Hollywood movies where some guy gets punched in the face, falls down, and gets right back up, and he's just fine. You know, you don't take beatings like that. When we're talking about beating like this, we're not talking about just a slap on the face. We're talking beating. And you imagine that as graphically as you want to. Paul was beaten, and that was a terrible thing for him to have to undergo. Maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe he had a fever or illness. Again, one example was given malaria or something like that. He got sick. You know, Timothy had stomach issues. We know that because Paul told him to take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Maybe Paul got into some bad water somewhere or some bad bit of potato or whatever the case may be. We don't know. A general but continual problem. In other words, something that Paul had that was a continual issue that he was dealing with. Again, that takes us back to what we've already mentioned, Paul's thorn in the flesh, whatever that was, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7. And so again, we don't know what this was. Paul suffered though. And I have weird thoughts when I'm preparing class and usually don't share those weird thoughts with you because then you'd think I'm weird. But question I wondered, why didn't Paul just heal himself?
Because he says God put a thorn in his side.
Okay.
And that tells me that God, why would he say, well, because of my beating that God happened, here's my problem.
Yeah.
He says something was wrong before all that.
Yeah. So again, it was something God gave him. So why would he think that he could heal it? Maybe he couldn't heal it. I don't know. Mike?
Paul never healed anyone.
Okay.
It was Jesus Christ or God that healed. And so when Paul got ready to heal himself, he asked to be healed. God said no.
God said no.
But yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah. And again, Paul was willing and able and wanting to do God's will, and when God told him, no, I'm not going to heal you from that, what was Paul to do? Tell God, sorry, but I'm going to do it anyway? Well, doesn't seem to be the methodology of Paul in any way, shape, form, or fashion. So, again, interesting questions we don't have an answer to. Maybe this has something to do with it, and Dave's already brought this one up. If possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Well, again, why did he say that? Unless maybe that was the issue that he was dealing with the church at Galatia. And again, a majority of scholars, and that the majority of scholars doesn't mean anything. They can be just as wrong as they can be. But a majority of scholars suggest that maybe it was his eyesight that he had trouble with. Galatians 6 and verse 7, see with what large letters I have written to you with my own hand. We know Paul had an amanuensis, a scribe that wrote a lot of his letters, and maybe that was the reason he couldn't see well. But the fact that he says, you would have plucked your own eyes out and given to me if you could have, and if that would have been helpful, you would have done that. And so again, he's complimenting the churches of Galatia for their goodness and their wanting to do right and their ability to do right. And even though he's had to tell them, you've been doing wrong with all this other stuff, I know the character of the people that you are. And I'm asking you to live up to that character. Because I know you'd have given me your eyes if you could have, if it was possible. And again, does that mean that was his thorn in the flesh? Don't know. Don't have a clue. Good suggestion, could be, possibly. And in the long run, does it really matter what his thorn in the flesh was? The answer to that is no.
Verse 14, he told me, regardless of what infirmity I had, you received me as an angel. He was Jesus Christ, they were so thrilled and so happy with blessings that he brought to them. And then he said, you were so happy you wouldn't want that drive.
Yeah. Advance it less, please. And my trial, which was in my flesh, you did not despise or reject, but you received me as an angel of God, even as Christ Jesus. So, again, whatever this issue was, and again, we don't know. Dave suggested maybe body or, could have been leprosy or something of that nature, of that ilk. I, again, don't know what it was that would have made him off-putting to the church, and yet they accepted him in that context. Maybe it has a little bit to do with, you remember the guy who was healed from being blind, and the question was asked, who sinned that this man was born blind? And the point was, nobody. But this happened to show the power of God through him, back in the days when Jesus walked the face of the planet. And so, again, maybe they were thinking that, okay, Paul has this affliction. What did he do wrong to be being punished for that? Again, I don't know. Just an option, just an idea of what could have been the issue that he was dealing with, and why they might have been resistant to accept him, because their mindset was, well, there's something wrong with him because of that. Dave?
It kind of, Paul had all kinds of barriers
Mm-hmm.
in his ministry before as an apostle, and this seems to me it was one of them.
Yeah.
That he didn't let anything keep him from doing the job. Jesus says, I must tell you how much you must suffer in my name, to take the message before the Gentiles. This could be just one of those things that Jesus said you're going to suffer.
Sure.
You oppose the church, and you're going to pay a price for that, but you're going to be a great apostle.
Sure. Again, lesson for us. Paul, whatever he was dealing with, put that aside. I mean, he had to deal with it because it was something with him every day. But he put that aside because preaching the gospel was more important. And so the lesson for Kevin, and I'll speak for me, is, we've got to be out evangelizing. We've got to be out doing what the work of the church is. But I got this hangnail, and it's kind of bothering me. And again, I use that as a silly illustration, but sometimes my excuses are that silly, aren't yours? Knowing what we should do, and yet, we let the littlest things get in the way. Paul, whatever he's dealing with, I don't think this was a little thing in his life. I think it was something he struggled with, something that caused him grief, and he kept on preaching in spite of it. Flo? Yeah, what Paul had been, first time they beat me like that, I might have been done. And you might have too. Left me for dead, I'm not going back there. But what did he do? God went back in the city. Like, what were you thinking, Paul? Pam.
Suffering. If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger.
There you go. Suffering, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And if it kills you, you go to heaven and everything's great. Bob.
I have a question over there.
Yeah. Have a comment over here? Yes.
I was going to say that maybe, in a lot of ways, Paul was an epistle for everyone, because he may have been, for lack of a better word, mutilated in some shape or form. And so when people saw him and then saw the beauty that he was bringing with the word, he was that epistle that no matter what is going on in my life, I'm still going to let my light shine for all of you to show you that we can still do the work of the Lord, even though we're going through these afflictions.
Absolutely. And could everybody hear that comment? No. Basically, Julie said, Paul had all this stuff going on, maybe mutilated, maybe beat up, and yet he was still preaching the gospel. He could go on and do that in spite of that, and he was bringing the beauty of the gospel in spite of that physical infirmity. And that's a good message for us. and a good way to end the class. Thank you.